The US government debt just crossed $34 trillion. In 2022 alone, the United States paid almost $500 billion just to service its debt. I mean, can you imagine that for a moment? The United States had to borrow money in order to pay the interest on its debt. Imagine having a credit card debt, and your debt is so high that you can't even afford to pay the interest. So you have to go to another bank, borrow money in order to pay the interest on your credit card debt. That is the point when you know that you have messed up. And the only way to get out of that debt is to cut all of your spending, work super hard, and at least pay a portion of your debt in order to be able to afford at least to service that debt. And that is why Ray Dalio thinks that the United States has reached a point of no return. But if the United States has such a huge problem with debt, why its economy is performing so well? I mean, compared to China and Europe, United States is ahead of both of them. China is struggling with its deflation and can't force its population to keep spending. Europe is lagging behind, while the United States is ahead of the world. So what exactly is happening here? You see, debt by itself is not really as bad as people imagine, especially when you have to build a country. I mean, if you borrow money in order to build infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and schools, in order to make your citizens productive so that they pay more taxes, that is a great way to increase the productivity and the economy of your country. That only becomes a problem when you borrow too much money that you can't even afford it. And if you look at the United States debt to GDP ratio, you will realize three big jumps. The first jump was back in the 1990s, when the United States understood that it can actually borrow money to solve its problems. That's when we have the dot-com crisis. But that was just the beginning, because in 2008, when the US economy collapsed and took with it the rest of the world, what do you think the United States did? Exactly, it just borrowed money to solve that crisis. I mean, the United States can't just sit aside and watch how its economy is declining. It had to do something. And the easiest way to solve a crisis is just borrow money and solve the crisis. And the third jump was in 2020. Yes, that's when people were sitting at homes and the government just borrowed money and distributed it cash to people. Not just to people, but literally to companies. That is when we had the biggest jump. So what is important here is that how much debt the country has compared to its GDP. The first time it became 100% of the GDP, it was in 2008. And when the government just slowly started paying its debt, we had a pandemic. So right now, the debt to GDP ratio is around 120%, which is extremely high. However, this is not the highest ratio because we have countries such as Italy or Greece that have a much higher debt to GDP ratio than the United States. Or take an example of Japan that has a debt to GDP ratio of 260%. So if we have such examples, why the United States should be worried? I mean, there is still a lot of room to grow. There is a room to borrow much more money than the United States has already borrowed. Well, that is true for Japan and it worked for them. It's definitely not going to work for the United States because if you look at Japan, the Japanese economy didn't grow for the last 30 years. In fact, it actually shrunk since then. Imagine if that happened to the United States. I mean, China would have already overtaken the United States. The US dollar is the global currency reserve, and the only way for the United States to keep that status is for the US economy to keep growing and not stagnating like it happened with Japan. Secondly, Japan is not spending hundreds of billions of dollars in order to maintain a global military presence where it's ready to fight anyone, anywhere across the globe. I mean, if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, it's the United States that's gonna spend hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, helping Taiwan to defend itself against China. And for the United States to be able to do something like that, its economy should always keep growing so that it can keep increasing that military budget. And the US military budget is a little shy of $1 trillion. You cannot see something like that in Japan or anywhere else in the world. And if Greece or Italy defaults on their loans or may not be able to grow their economies, they can always rely on their biggest brothers, such as Germany or the United States, to fix their economies. But the US does not have that option because the United States is the big brother here. Who do you think the United States is going to rely on if it cannot grow its economy? China? So as you can see that the United States does not have the exact same options that Japan has, or Greece or Italy. I mean, of course it can try to take that path, but it will no longer be the superpower that it's today. Its currency is not gonna be the global currency reserve. But what people today don't realize is that the United States wasn't the superpower that it's today all the time. I mean, if you go back like 100 years ago, the United States was no one compared to Germany or Russia. These were the countries that actually had much more influence on the global stage than the United States. But then guess what happened? World War I, when all of these countries suddenly decided to destroy each other for some stupid reasons. And the United States kept its distance from World War I. And guess what? The United States became richer while these countries became poorer. You have no idea how much wealth was actually transferred from Europe and the rest of the world to the United States during this period. This is when the United States economy started growing and started having some weight on the global stage. So it's the end of the World War II, and the United States literally represents half of the global economy. Yes, the rest of the world is on one side and the United States alone is on the other side. And 80% of the global gold reserves were just in the United States because the US was busy selling everything to the rest of the world while making all of the money, while the rest of the world just got poorer and were entirely destroyed. This was the moment when the United States was literally the most powerful country on the face of the earth. This was the moment when the United States could literally invade any country on the face of the earth, even the Soviet Union or Germany or France, and the world couldn't do anything. And that's how the global world order was created, when the United States was the most powerful economy in the world. And guess what percentage of the global economy the United States is representing today? It's not even like 30%, it's around 15%. And the worst part about it is that the United States has to borrow money to pay the interest on its debt, which makes it even worse. So the main question is, can the United States keep borrowing money? The short answer is no, because at some point, debt is going to become worthless. You see, in order for investors to keep buying US government bonds, the US government bond should offer a higher interest rate than inflation, but at least maybe 1 to 2%, something like that. Let's take an average of 1.5%. So if inflation today is around 4%, then government bonds should at least offer like 5.5%. So if you take a look right now at 10-year government bonds, then they're around probably like 4%. That is great, that's a decent return. However, if you compare that to inflation, then you're not really making any money. You're just trying to maintain your level of wealth, even though you're actually getting cash on hands. However, if you take a look at 3-month government bonds, then they're around 5.3% or something like that. Yes, these are not like great returns when we have such a high inflation, but they're still decent to a certain extent, and the United States can still borrow money at that rate. However, if you have watched what Jay Powell said about interest rates, it's planning to lower the rates because the US economy is not really doing great. The Fed has to lower the rates for the US economy to keep growing. I mean, the question is, what does that mean for government bonds? When the Fed lowers the rates, government bonds go down as well. And that means that inflation is not going to stop. Inflation will be around 4%, and the Fed is going to lower the rates, which means that the rates for the bonds will decrease, which will make it extremely difficult for the US government to raise more money, to borrow more money. Now, there is one way for the United States to save itself, and that is to stop running on a deficit. That means that cutting a lot of spending, making sure that it starts paying at least portion of its debt so that it can actually not borrow money to serve its debt and at least afford that debt in the first place. Now, if you take a look at the US budget, you will find out that at least half of it is military spending. So the only way for the US to pay its debt is to cut military budget. But that means that the United States should stop supporting Ukraine to fight Russians. That means that the United States should tell Taiwan that they will no longer protect them. That means that the United States will have to withdraw from Middle East. Basically, that is the end of the US global dominance. That is the end of the world order that the United States created after World War II. On the other hand, if the United States is not going to do that and keep increasing its military budget, that means that at some point the United States will no longer be able to service its debt. And that means the end of the US dollar anyways. What made the United States great in the first place is that it actually focused on growing its economy and stayed away from the conflicts. But if you take a look at what's happening in the last 30 years, United States was literally involved in every single war across the world. It literally spent trillions of dollars to fight Iraq, wage a war in Afghanistan, and the rest of the world. While if you take a look at China, it actually pursued the exact same strategy that the United States did before World War II, which is focusing on trade and not waging war against anyone. But according to Ray Dalio, that is not the only challenge that the United States is facing. If you take a look at the United States, you will find out that the wealth gap has been increasing dramatically over the last 50 years. I mean, just go back to 1970s and you will find out that the average house price was literally just 3 times the annual income. But if you take a look at the data, then the average house price is literally 6 times the annual income. People got twice poorer over the last 50 years. And that's not the only indicator to take a look to see the wealth gap. Just take a look at the stock market. 10% of the US population literally owns over 90% of the stock market. I mean, we live in a world where we have like a small minority of the people literally having all the wealth in the country, while the vast majority of the people literally holds no wealth at all in this country. Most of the housing market is literally unaffordable for the vast majority, for 99% of Americans. While it's easy to say that that's how capitalism works, I mean, the people who work hard, the people who take risks, they're making all the money, while the people who are lazy, people who are not working as hard, yes, they are poor. This is capitalism. Get used to it. Life is unfair. I understand all of that. However, if you take a look at the consequences of that, is that when people don't have a roof over their heads, when people cannot afford to put food on the table, you know what happens is that extremists on both sides will rise. And that means that crime will rise in the country, and that will hurt business. Governing a country will be extremely difficult when you have so many people who cannot afford just basic needs. Now, if you want the system to keep working, it's literally in the interest of the super rich in order for the system to keep running, for the economy to keep running. But for that to happen, you need to have a system where everybody can actually afford to meet their basic needs if they just work hard, if they can afford a roof over their head, if they can afford to put food on the table and feed their families. And the fact that the United States cannot even afford to serve its debts and has to borrow money to do that, you can say for a fact that the United States will not fix the wealth gap anytime soon. What also gave the United States a lead over the rest of the world is that after World War II, the United States was simply technologically more advanced than the rest of the world. But that gap has actually shrunk dramatically over the last 50 years. I mean, countries such as China and the rest of the world are actually leading the world in some technologies, especially when it comes to EVs or 5G network or something like that, especially when the United States sanctioned Russia, which is one of the largest economies in the world. The rest of the world took notice. They understood that if they aren't going to invest in themselves and create alternative systems that is independent from Uncle Sam, then one day the United States could actually sanction them just like they did with Russia. And Russia is one of the most important economies in the world. And that makes it even more expensive for the United States to maintain the global world order that it created back in 1945. And that is why Ray Dalio is convinced that we are on the brink of the greatest crash in the US history. We have reached a point of no return. When exactly that crash will happen, it's still unclear, but it will happen in the foreseeable future. But have we reached the point of no return? Absolutely. And the biggest crash in US history means that we are on the verge of the greatest wealth transformation in human history. Remember, every crisis is an opportunity for someone else to make money. Whenever someone is losing money, someone else is gaining that money. And guess where most of the wealth is? Exactly in the stock market. I mean, Ray Dalio himself actually built a personal net worth of over $15 billion from the stock market. And the people who know how the system works, people who understand how the stock market works, people who can actually read and analyze financial statements, read what's happening behind all of those charts, these are the people who are gonna benefit the most out of this wealth transformation. And that is why we launched the Intelligent Investing Academy, to teach you how the world's richest people are actually making so much money in the stock market. How are they getting ready in order to benefit from this massive wealth transformation? It's gonna happen once in a lifetime. Of course, you can go on and learn on yourself everything, but in the Intelligent Investing Academy, we teach you everything way faster, and you will avoid the mistakes that often cost people thousands of dollars. So if you are ready to put in the work and hustle and learn how all of these billionaires, world's richest people, are actually preparing for this massive wealth transformation, then go ahead and check out the Intelligent Investing Academy. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.